Now that brings us to chapter 31, where the story continues. So now 6 years have gone by. And it says in verse 1, "Now Jacob heard the words of Laban's sons, saying, Jacob has taken away all that was our father's, and from what was our father's he has acquired all this wealth." Over time, as Jacob became prosperous, circumstances changed for him. His relationship with his in-laws soured. Laban's sons accused Jacob of stealing their father's wealth, and this, of course, was false. Jacob didn't steal the wealth of Laban. In fact, the opposite is true. We saw in chapter 30 that Laban's wealth came from Jacob. So he didn't steal his wealth. Jacob's wealth and prosperity were entirely due to Jacob's own efforts and God blessing his efforts. But Laban's sons became envious of Jacob's success, and they began to spread this false accusation about him, accused him of becoming rich by taking the wealth of Laban, their father. And we have seen envy several times in the book of Genesis, going all the way back to Cain and Abel. And this is a theme that keeps repeating in the book of Genesis. And the reason envy keeps coming up is because envy is part of the sin nature. Envy is part of the sin nature. And throughout history, we see people who resent the success of others. Rather than emulate them, they resent them. And like with Laban's sons, often they make up false accusations about the successful and how they acquired their success and their wealth. Envy will distort the truth. Envy will create a false narrative. In your own mind, you can create this whole false narrative about somebody when you're envious of them. If you've ever had someone make false statements about you, then you know it can be very hurtful to have someone say things that just simply aren't true about you. And you may feel compelled to defend yourself, defend your reputation. But the best thing you can do is to let the Lord defend you. He can defend your reputation better than you. You know, in Matthew chapter 5, Jesus said, God blesses you when people mock you and persecute you and lie about you and say all sorts of evil things against you because you are my followers. Be happy about it. Be very glad, for a great reward awaits you in heaven. And remember, the ancient prophets were persecuted in the same way. Jesus said there's a great reward awaiting you in heaven for enduring false accusations. And he says we're in good company because there are many people in the Bible who had false things said about them. Most of all, Jesus. Jesus had false things said about him. It was envy that put Jesus on the cross. Matthew chapter 28, verse 17 says the religious leaders turned Jesus over to Pilate because of envy. They were envious of his popularity. And they turned him over to Pilate, and then they made false accusations to Pilate about Jesus to condemn him. Now, not only did Laban's sons turn against Jacob, but Laban himself also turned against Jacob. We see in verse 2, and Jacob saw the countenance of Laban. And indeed, it was not favorable toward him as before. Laban's countenance, his attitude towards Jacob changed. Things have changed for Jacob. The relationships have changed now. And so now we see in verse 3, then the Lord said to Jacob, return to the land of your fathers and to your family, and I will be with you. The Lord spoke to Jacob, telling him to return back home to Canaan. And it's important for us to note here how the Lord got Jacob to leave Haran and move back to Canaan. what did God use to get Jacob to move, to get Jacob to leave? Often God will lead us in the same way that he led Jacob here in the passage. So it's important for us to note the way that God got Jacob to go, the way that God got Jacob to move. First of all, Jacob had a desire to return back to the land of Canaan. You may remember that from chapter 30 last week. As soon as his 14 years of service were completed, Jacob wanted to go home to Canaan. He had a desire. For all the years that he was there in Haran, he had a desire, a longing to return home to Canaan. And sometimes God will stir up our nest by putting a desire in our heart, or by putting a longing in our heart to do something or to change something. In Psalm 37, verse 4, it says, "Delight yourself also in the Lord, and he shall give you the desires of your heart." Now, that promise doesn't mean that God will give you what your heart desires. That verse means that if you delight yourself in the Lord will put his desires in your heart, so that God's desires become your desires. And so God may move us to do something by putting a desire in our heart, by just placing a longing in our heart. In the Old Testament, Nehemiah was living in Persia, and he hears a report about the difficulties those living in Jerusalem were facing, and Nehemiah was moved by the report that he heard. And Nehemiah developed just a burden for Jerusalem. And so for Nehemiah, it began with a burden. He hears this report to do something, and he develops a burden. I remember years ago, the Transparenti family, I remember Mark Transparenti calling me before they went to the mission field to the Philippines. They were out in California, and Mark went to this meeting at church, and it was about going to the Philippines on a short-term mission trip. And the pastor said something like, if you're open and available and you have time, we sure could use your help. And Mark said, I sat there and I thought, well, I'm available. I've got time. And he began to develop a burden to go to the mission field. And just like with Nehemiah, it began with a burden for Jerusalem, and Nehemiah couldn't shake the burden, and God used that burden to move Nehemiah to Jerusalem. In the New Testament, the Apostle Paul writes to the Romans, and he tells them, I long to see you. Paul longed to go to Rome and minister to the believers in Rome, and Paul longed to go to Rome for several years, and eventually he made his way to Rome. Again, the Lord may stir you up by putting a longing in your heart, or a desire in your heart, or some kind of burden on your heart.